Hello everyone, hope you're doing good. A warm welcome to everyone at the first episode of ISCM Supply Chain Prism. Thank you all for being there. To all the attendees, certain ground rules, this platform is on listen only mode, and on the right hand side of the control panel, there is a questions section where you can type in and send your questions which will be answered post the talk. Today we have with us two eminent personalities discussing forecasting and demand planning under uncertainty. Let me welcome our guest, Stefan de Kok, who is the CEO of Wahupa, a supply chain software startup in Atlanta, USA. He has a long career in all sides of supply chain, performing many different roles in many industries. He spends most of his time in demand, inventory optimization, manufacturing, and IBP. Over the years, he noticed that every implementation of supply chain software was making the same mistakes and flaws that caused large inefficiencies and a perceptual state of firefighting. This motivated him to develop a new product that did not have those flaws, and together with Stephen's background as an applied mathematician to probabilistic planning and forecasting. He is in the process of writing the book, his first book in the topic, and you will find him online, mostly on LinkedIn, where he's happy to connect and answer whatever questions he can. I would like to also introduce Dr. Rakesh Singh, Chairman of Institute of Supply Chain Management, an expertise in the domain of supply chain, demand planning, IBP, forecasting. He has taught in some of the best B schools in India, Middle East, and Europe. I welcome both our speakers and request Dr. Singh to take the talk ahead. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of Supply Chain Prism, a talk show which will explore perception, idea, solution management in the domain of supply chain management, demand planning, forecasting, and various other related fields over a period of time. Today, I'm happy to host Stefan de Kok, who is a great mind in the domain of demand planning and forecasting and a pioneer in probabilistic forecasting, who has provided a very strong understanding to demand planning and forecasting in the era when there is a lot of talk about forecasting. In fact, there are so many practitioners in India who say that RIP forecasting. We will explore that particular framework today and also look at it in a historical perspective, because what we see in India is that more of firefighting, demand planning in any way has been in disarray, and companies have not given a very strong and have not had very strong focus on building an ecosystem for effective demand planning and hence supply chain management from end to end. This pandemic, which started as a supply shock, became a demand shift shock, and I think it brought about a lot of issues in focus and making everybody think very differently. I see a lot of change in the attitude in the supply chain war room, where people started coordinating with each other with all functional areas to meet the near term demand, that is tomorrow demand, by having a single minute plan for their supply chain and reacting in a collaborative and in a non-silos way to meet the challenges of pandemic. And some of friends here who are attending have also made that very clear on our webinar series that we conducted on forecasting and demand planning. So to start and not waste much time on explanation of what uncertainty is, as I have got a guest here, I'm putting the question to him. And Stefan, what are the key critical issues in demand planning and forecasting today? How has the pandemic disrupted planning? And if you remember what Gartner is saying, that we need to move from a deterministic planning to more resilient planning. They have their own framework of defining resilient planning. So, what are the kind of uncertainty this pandemic brings and complicates the uncertainty that already existed in the planning process?
Thank you, Rakesh, for having me here. So yeah, the interesting question to start off. A couple, in fact. So I think there's really two sides to this question, and one of them is the critical patterns that are already occurring and have been occurring for the last, couple of decades. And the other one is the very special situation that we have today with the pandemic. So let me answer the pandemic portion here, and I think we've got a couple of questions on the the changes that are happening in the industry in general further down. So the pandemic that we have right now is what we call a black swan, which basically means this is an event that occurs once every 100 years in this case, and the impact is dramatic. So it's very different than what we're used to seeing in our typical supply chains and the forecast that we need to prepare to use for our supply response. And that the response in this case is still the primary tool that we have to deal with the initial jolt of pulse that we get from a pandemic. There's not much a forecast can do to foresee that a black swan is coming. But now that we know it's here, and especially you see it occurring in new regions, you're going to see new pulses appear in different areas, and the story then repeats itself. Once that pulse has happened, how do we deal with that? How do we make sure it doesn't mess up our forecast? And then our forecasting ability needs to make sure it finds patterns real quickly to be able to find where that new normal is going to be, of course, but also in the more immediate term, where's that pattern going and how can we respond to it immediately? From a strategic perspective, we need a longer view of demand, and the uncertainty becomes different, it becomes bigger, and strategically we need to basically try and prevent our company or supply chains from breaking down when the next black swan occurs. It could be a black swan, could be a gray swan. We have economic recessions, we have trade wars, we have any kind of other major impact that might not be as big as the coronavirus pandemic, but it's it definitely has the potential to disrupt. And that's the strategic portion of our plans that also need to be led by a forecast that embraces the uncertainty, so you can build that resiliency, and as you mentioned, as Gartner lists it, into your supply chain, because once it hits, it's all down to operations and in some degree to the tactics on how to respond with the aftermath.
Thank you, Stefan. And as you talked about, we need forecast. I think I said a lot of us thinks that forecasting at times is full of error. There's one of the reasons why a large number of organizations in India do not really move towards forecasting. They believe that forecasting is never right. You have been a proponent of to forecast or not to forecast, and you have given some very good ideas about this particular question. Within a supply chain, what are your views in terms of forecasting? To forecast or not to forecast?
Well, here in the United States, they say horses for courses, which means you need to have the right tool for the right job, basically. And there's definitely times when you can go without a forecast, and there's times when you absolutely need a forecast. I think most companies by now realize that when we look far into the future, tactical decisions, maybe fewer companies have realized this for the strategic decisions even further, that a forecast is almost indispensable. although a lot of companies go about it in what would be called a naive way. In the operational decision-making processes, it becomes a little unclear. I like to hold to one very simple rule. If you know what's going to happen, don't forecast. Right? The moment you don't know exactly what's going to happen, that's when you forecast. And that exact, of course, is or not exact, is not a black and white. It's something that grows. Maybe a company will get most of their sales orders in the next week, maybe 2 weeks. And there's a period of time when all the sales orders are known. That's the time frame within which you don't need a forecast. Right? You need to just respond to what you know is true. But as you move out, a little bit more uncertainty comes in. Some orders have received, not all of them. What do you do with that little bit of uncertainty? And as you grow further into the future, at some point you get into a range where nothing is known, and well, you have no other choice but to use a forecast.
Thank you, Stefan. I think it takes us to the next question. If we have to look at different planning approaches like SNLP and IBP, which resides to a great extent on demand baseline, which are based largely on forecasting. While we deal with this pandemic, how relevant are these two approaches in pandemic, post-pandemic?
Yeah, so SNLP, so there's a discussion about SNLP and IBP and if they are the same or if they're just flavors of the same thing or something different. I'm of the opinion that the two are very different. So SNLP to me is a tactical tool. It tries to answer the question, how do we align sales, operations, how do we get ready, how do we remove constraints? Where IBP has a big strategic component to it, or should have a big strategic component to it, which tries to say, where do we want to take this company and how do we execute against it and all the parts that fall between it, which could include a tactical level, which might be like an SNLP or an SNLP on steroids, as some would call it, but that's definitely not all of it. And of course, it's much broader. The tactical part, the SNLP part, if you will, has a major role to play as this pandemic is unfolding, or as any major event has occurred that has disrupted a supply chain. We still have the time to get our product to the store for 2 weeks from now, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks from now, all within that tactical horizon. The strategic part, once that event has hit, you've really passed the point where the strategy can be adjusted to make a difference. You better have one in place already. All the resiliency, it comes down into the strategy. Are you ready? Or the tactics is more about, okay, now how do we get out of this mess?
All right. I think, how do you get out of this mess? And I think in India, we have been having a very interesting debate among largely FMCGs, but there are a lot of other players also which are talking about the emergence of demand-driven MRP as a solution to converting this deterministic model into more resilient model. And a major critique has been that because SNLP sits on aggregate forecast and MRP, and bills of material and other things are determined on aggregate forecast, and you disaggregate forecast to make decision. What is needed is something that is like DDMRP. I know your views on, as a friend, we know your views on DDMRP, but I think is DDMRP a tool that is, sitting on a larger model which is resilient in its nature and is useful during the time of pandemic?
Yeah, so DDMRP to me is not any more or any less resilient than other types of planning approaches. But yes, it does sit in a much bigger model. In fact, there's three models there: an operational, tactical, and a strategic one. DDMRP sits in the operational one, and it's a very cohesive set of models that together would allow some kind of improvement in resiliency, especially if you compare it with the old version of what it mostly replaces, which is MRP. MRP is notorious for introducing the bullwhip, and DDMRP does a great job at positioning decoupling points, shortening active lead times. So not the cumulative lead time, which is what a material replenishment planning uses in MRP, but condensing them so that every stage operates simultaneously to satisfy its own immediate needs and doesn't really care about what's going up and downstream from them. And that's a very important part, and that is, I think that leans back to the last question. By reducing that lead time, you can respond to what you know for if sales orders happened to have occurred within that the maximum effective lead time that you might have, then you're all set. So in a scenario like that, you don't need a forecast, and I would assume you've got a great resiliency against all the normal type of variability that an average industry might encounter. But again, when a black swan like a pandemic comes along, I don't think there's much that can protect you against that unless you get your strategy right first and have built that resiliency ahead of time.
So, Stefan, going to my next question about resiliency, but before going into that, I would like you to know you have been a very strong supporter of DDMRP and the biggest critique of DDMRP. Your LinkedIn posts really bring about the two, bimodal distribution of your thought. And this bimodal distribution of your thought is very important. What, according to you, is good and not so good in MRP? Here in India, there's a large amount of interest in DDMRP. And there's large number of interest in terms of people are wanting to build this resilience even at a normal time. So what, according to you, is good and not so good?
Yeah, so first of all, I like to believe myself to be balanced. So I'm not a DDMRP expert, which means, if you ask me, what are the benefits you can get, I cannot speak with authority. On the other side, I'm also not a skeptic. I can definitely see both sides of that coin. So if you think about DDMRP, there's three parts to it. The first part is it's a methodology, which I personally think is its biggest strength. So if companies are not very mature in their supply chain processes, as we like to think about maturity these days, being a methodology, it's just great. It allows everyone to get on board quickly, to have a joint vision, a joint understanding of what's going on, and to basically get change management from an old way, which might be based on the inefficiency of MRP, or it might be based on something completely ad hoc. So the ability to transform and to get all the noses pointed the right way, if you will, within a company, and everyone working towards the same goals. That's a major strength. The second part of DDMRP is it's part of a bigger cohesive planning and execution framework. I mentioned that in the last question. So I think that's another strength, right? That you can start with one part. In this case, DDMRP is usually the term that comes up a lot, but there's there's a lot of other parts to that demand-driven model. It's the one that catches the attention. It's the easiest point to start a demand-driven journey, as they like to call it. But you can start it knowing that there's going to be a step 2, step 3, step 4, if that's where you want to go. It's not a dead-end street. And all the parts have been designed to work together so that you're not introducing yet another functional silo. So I think that's another great strength of DDMRP. The third one is, and that's I think what's gotten most of the critique by myself, but also by others, is the formulas and the approaches to do various calculations. And I think that is a weakness. I don't think they're insurmountable, and I think the founders of the Demand Driven Institute are quick to tell you that it's a starting point, which is a vision I like. So there's a number of different solutions, software solutions, not related to the Demand Driven Institute, that have implemented DDMRP, and various have already taken all kinds of innovations and added that onto it and replaced some of the basic calculations. So I think there's a great potential there. You can tweak it, and I'm sure that if we look at anything that's published by the official institute 10 years from now, we're going to see that they're presenting it different, and they're going to have a more sophisticated view already. As what we see right now is definitely more sophisticated than what they had 5 years ago. So this is an evolving model, and I think we should watch it closely. I think it has a great potential. Ultimately, I see it as a tool in your toolbox, and definitely worth considering. It might not be the right tool for everyone, but it's definitely going to be a great tool for a lot of companies. My idea.
It's a very strong tool for everybody in the long run, and it bases its decision making and decoupling and buffering in the supply chain based on demand sensing. And I think if I'm right, it is here that demand sensing is highly debatable, even criticized, and there are a lot of very critical but positive suggestions to make sensing through sales order a very prominent tool as an input in making demand planning approaches or demand-driven approaches or demand-driven supply chains more effective. What are your thinking on that?
Well, so personally, I don't believe that DDMRP is really doing any sensing. So to me, sensing is looking at demand further downstream. In fact, I believe that sensing, seeing the demand further downstream, basically you're getting demand and finer granularity and sooner, is actually a nice complement to the so-called demand-driven model. Although, in my opinion, demand sensing is the true demand-driven. There's a couple of things that are confusing the matter. If you want to buy a demand sensing software product, it usually also includes forecasting, right? It's got pattern recognition, and basically those are two different things. And the forecasting part is usually bad. The sensing part is, undeniably good. You're getting demand closer to the consumer, and you're getting it sooner. You're getting it without any of the supply decisions that your customers have made in between. Like the customer might buy one or two in the store, but then the retailer decides to order a whole pallet, and suddenly you've changed a very smooth pattern into a very intermittent, lumpy pattern. And then as a supplier, you get the sales order, which is lumpy. It makes everything a lot more difficult. So the demand sensing part allows you to remove the bullwhip effect before it comes to your door in the shape of a sales order, and then the demand-driven part, or I like to think of that as order-driven part, where you take the sales order, that allows you to get rid of the bullwhip effect that you would yourself add to that. Combined, they have this huge potential. Now, demand sensing is easier said than done. Demand driven is relatively easy to do, but demand sensing requires you to get a lot of information from your own customers and maybe your customers' customers. And most companies cannot get that information. And the companies that can usually can only get it from some of their bigger customers. If you here in the US, for example, retailers, big retailers like Walmart and Target and Kroger, they'll share that kind of information with their suppliers, and they can perform their demand sensing logic on that and merge it with their other demand streams. But then you have the smaller chains that don't do that. You got to find a way to blend that together. So it's a difficult proposition. It's not undoable, but I think the value of doing so, if that data is available, that's a gold mine, because it effectively gives you a head notice of what's coming and gives you much more time to respond. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. So I think that's fair enough. In India, we have a very layered distribution system where there are a lot of asymmetry of information, and this goes up in a very big way to the old framework of bullwhip, where the information gets distorted at every clearance of supply chain. So I think that can become a big hurdle. And also what happens is that organizations who have moved out of this kind of asymmetry, and they're looking at this. One good thing that you talked about is that demand sensing is good, forecasting is not. And let me go back to your favorite topic here, that though we do forecasting, you have been defining good maths and bad maths in forecasting, and how the statistical forecasting is very different than probabilistic forecasting. Why the statistical forecasting is bad, whereas the probabilistic forecasting can be very effectively used in demand planning and supply chain planning. This is.
Yeah, so this gets down to really where my heart is. This is where what I'm all about is the probabilistic forecasting and probabilistic planning. So probably for those viewers who do not yet know quite what we mean with probabilistic forecasting, I can give a little example before I answer your question. Imagine maybe 30 years ago, if there was a weather forecast, they would say maybe tomorrow it would rain, or they would say tomorrow it would not rain. This is what you might call a traditional forecast. Today, if you get the weather forecast, they say it's a 40% chance of rain. So now, if you are organizing, say, a children's outdoor birthday party, with 40% chance of rain, you can make a decision that says, should I make a backup plan in case it rains and that we have an indoor activity? In the old days, if the weather forecaster said no rain, and then you had a 40% chance of being wrong, and it did rain, you're going to blame the forecaster for ruining your kid's party, and you'd be right to do so. In today's world, if it was 40% chance of rain and you didn't take any backup plan, you can only blame yourself. And this is the same equivalency with a traditional forecast and a probabilistic forecast. A traditional forecast, really all the decisions have been made, and you have no real idea about what's the uncertainty that goes with that one number. Next month, we're going to sell 100 units. It's not a 99, it's not 101. It's exactly 100. We have no idea, how bad or how good it could be. On a probabilistic forecast, you get a whole range of options. Basically, it gives you a time series of probability distributions as opposed to a time series of numbers. So whether it's a daily forecast, weekly, monthly, quarterly, doesn't really matter. But for that granularity, for any item, you'll get a series, and every series will have, for each period, a distinct distribution. So imagine that not 100 units is what's going to be sold tomorrow, but anywhere between 50 and 200. And maybe there's this distribution curve that says any number within that range has a certain probability of occurring. So that's a probabilistic forecast, if you will, and you can apply that same replacing of every number that represents something uncertain. You can apply that same concept to planning processes, not just forecast processes. So when we run a machine, it's not going to produce exactly 20,000 units. There's a degree in there. If you've got a chemical process, the yield is not going to be exactly a certain amount. There's some kind of range in that and a distribution within that range. So that, I hope, explains a little bit what the two are. So when is it good to have a statistical versus a probabilistic forecast? That was your question. If patterns are really smooth, usually, fast-moving goods, demand patterns, or patterns at high levels of aggregation, the kind of patterns you will often find in tactical and strategic planning, where you're operating at very high levels of aggregation. You're not planning individual stock keeping units and individual locations. You might be planning entire categories or product types as a whole. You'll see smooth patterns, and the demand tends to be normally distributed. And these are the innate assumptions that a statistical forecast or any deterministic forecast makes, which fit perfectly fine there. But the moment you get more granular, or your patterns become more intermittent, that starts to break down, right? And in fact, we're at a place where the constructs that used to work 50, 40, 30 years ago have been breaking down because companies have been globalizing, portfolios have been proliferating, and everything's getting fragmented. And oh yeah, the customer is demanding faster service, so now we got to have smaller time periods to know what we need to ship next week rather than next month. And everything gets more fragmented, and all these patterns become non-normal, and they become intermittent, meaning there's periods with zero demand. And in those cases, the traditional forecasts break down. In those cases, the probabilistic forecasts shine. And in the extreme, the probabilistic forecast will show you a normal distribution at the highest level, but it smoothly transitions down. And another very important case, which I think has gotten not of visibility these days, is forecast consumption. So if you assume that in the far future we're going to take a forecast, in the near future we're going to use sales orders, there's a gray area in the middle where you have some orders, but you're going to have to complement it in some way with a forecast. And that's where forecast consumption comes into play, and that's where the largest amount of error and bias is introduced in today's processes. So that is, I think, a very important area where a probabilistic forecast will give you tremendous benefit.
Can probabilistic forecasts help us build scenarios in the near and the short run, and also build the long run? Because as you say, that probabilistic forecast would really give us a range, where the uncertainty can be understood and unknown demand can be made into known variability. How do you really use them in terms of scenarios, both for short run and long run?
So so there's really two kinds of scenarios. One is, what's my worst case or my best case, or what's the most likely case? And another type of scenario is, what if we did this? What if we ran more promotions next quarter? Probabilistic forecast is naturally a fit for that first case. The second case, what can it, what would happen, that basically introduces another variable that whether you're probabilistic or not will have very similar impact, right? It's still better to look at it probabilistically than deterministically, but a real strength when people say, what do you mean with a scenario, that's the one, is what's the worst that could happen, right? If with everything we know, with all the budget spend that we have for promotions that we know today, what's going to happen? Well, the answer is not one number. So one level up is to turn that into what's called a range forecast. Usually, given in terms of confidence limits, from 5 to 95% range, our demand will be in there, and the two extremes we'll ignore for now because those could go really, really wide. But with 95% confidence, how high could demand be? With 95% confidence on the lower end, how low could demand be? Now you got two numbers, but in a statistical scenario, those numbers are still not really reliable. Because again, it assumes, in most cases today anyway, it assumes a normal distribution, and that means that there's a probability that demand actually will go negative. That's innate to the normal distribution, and demand naturally cannot go negative, which is an indicator that that's not right. And so what you'll see in a traditional range forecast, it gives you more information, better, it's still flawed. You typically tend to overestimate how low it can get, and you tend to underestimate how high it can get with most real-world data. So the probabilistic one does not make an assumption about the distribution, and it basically, instead of just giving you those two endpoints, the two ranges, it gives you that whole curve, and now anyone that uses it can determine where do they want to have their confidence. Maybe the person planning promotion says, I want to know the 95% confidence range, what's going to happen in the next 8 weeks if I do this, and I want to know that at a account product family level. The person in production might say, I want to know what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks with a 99% confidence range level, and I want to know that at a day individual item plant level. Everyone can make their own decision of what is that level of certainty that they want to have, and you could even make a trade-off that says, yeah, if we protect ourselves against the 99 level, it's going to be too expensive, but if we protect ourselves at the 97 level, I think we're going to be safe, right? And that's the kind of decision that you can now make. And you can make that at any level of granularity. So the promotion is more in the tactical range. The production example I gave is more in the operational range, and the same thing happens in the strategic range. And the same concept applies to all.
Thanks, Stephen. Let me go to the other parts of the question. As we talked and started with Gartner, suggesting a move from a deterministic to more resilient planning system, what we have seen is there's a lot of approaches that have emerged with the help of new technology, cloud platforms, digital supply chain train, AI and ML-based, analytics. What do you think? Are they going to replace the old approaches, or can we leverage them to build and broaden the horizon of planning?
Yeah, so again, it's use the right tool for the right application. So time series algorithms like statistical forecast and like probabilistic forecast are very good at predicting what's going to happen in a series of sequential numbers. And really good is relative, of course. Relative to, say, machine learning. or an artificial intelligence, which is very good at finding patterns, but not necessarily, it's more of a general purpose. Whereas the time series algorithms are a specific purpose for that task only, and they tend to outperform artificial intelligence, machine learning in that specific area. Although some are getting better, and who is to say that those approaches will start to outperform the traditional ones in that area? I believe that you can combine the two. That you would use a machine learning or an artificial intelligence for determining how high is my demand going to be when I introduce a new product. A time series algorithm will have nothing to work with because there's no history. But machine learning can say, hey, this looks a lot like this product over here and a little bit like that one over there, and you're introducing it in that market, which has characteristics similar to that. And in the past, when you did introductions, this is how it behaved. And so we believe the base level is going to be at some point, right? You can use a different machine learning algorithm to say, well, how's that trajectory going to be? Is it going to be a tremendous spike? And then it's going to level off a little bit, or is it going to be a slow ramp up? These are the kinds of things where artificial intelligence can do things that where machine learning basically is limited. Same thing with promotions planning. There's a lot. Basically, if there's not a good history of time series data, you'll find that other approaches will outshine them, and now you have to figure out a way to combine them. So a lot of statistical algorithms are limited in that fact because their whole logic is very cohesive, and it's very hard to break into it and say, no, in this case, I don't want to use the resultant value from last bucket in my exponential smoothing and inject a value here. That's hard, right? So there's a very limited amount of statistical algorithms that will allow you to do that. So we're going to see more and more approaches, I think, that allow a hybrid model where you basically use machine learning almost as a turbocharger on top of a time series algorithm. And I think a lot of these approaches will thus mature. I don't think there's really going to be, rip out everything that we've done in the past and replace it with something new. I don't think that thing is going to happen, but some parts of it will definitely start to go by the wayside.
So if you have to define this approach of demand forecasting and planning, and you have been talking about hybrid approach, what would be your final recommendation for a planning approach?
For a planning approach, well, so yeah, there's a lot of big answers possible to that. I can just give some rules of thumb. One is don't forecast what you know. And the difference between planning and forecasting, understand what you can control, plan it, and what you don't control but is uncertain, that's the part that you forecast. Bottom up is better than top down. And we're going to see a dramatic shift, I think, in that regards, that more and more algorithms are going to start becoming more pervasive that are able to do the bottom up, which is a notorious weakness of the more traditional approaches. And don't build silos. I think that's very important. So whatever you build needs to be able to fit into that bigger whole. So we talked about DDMRP. That is a great way to know that you're going to build something that already has a bigger whole that has gotten a lot of thought. More mature companies, who understand their own processes in great detail and know how to follow those processes, they can follow more of an a la carte approach and potentially tweak out more efficiency, more stability. And I think that is the pattern of the future. If I compare it to the past, it's all been about cost. It's all been about efficiency. what this pandemic hit home, I think, is that resiliency and stability are really important. Where the difference between the two is the resiliency part is that strategic aspect of how do we prepare for future major disruptions, and the stability is where probabilistic models come in, where you make plans that are no longer invalid the moment they're published because things change. All the plans have all these potential scenarios inherent in them, so they live longer. That brings a lot of stability. And all the forecasts can actually be 100% accurate, potentially. In server uptime, we talk about number of nines, 99.99 or 99.999. I see accuracy as the same thing. You never get exactly to 100%, but with the correct definition of accuracy, not mixing in precision that we do with today's metrics, we can see a focus from precision to accuracy. I think once people get a hang of that, they'll start to see much more clearly what needs to be done, and we're going to see very big improvements in especially stability. More so, we'll see improvements in efficiency, but I think stability is the one that we'll see the most improvement in the next 10 years. A lot of companies.
Stephen, one question off the way. Do you think if you replace the average daily use in DDMRP model by a probabilistic forecasting as well as sales order combination, it would become the most fit model to handle all kind of uncertainty?
Yeah, it is definitely.
This is an outcome of the debate we had on LinkedIn between all of us and Chad Smith. So I thought the major debate was on the average daily use, and you were very balanced in that that approach. But listening to you today, I feel that if ADU is replaced by sales order plus probabilistic, maybe a lot of sense may prevail in the decision making.
Yeah. So what we talk about in the forecasting domain is comparing a forecast against a naive forecast. A naive forecast is pretty much a forecast that doesn't include all the knowledge that you have about the future, and that's really what the ADU is. It is a naive forecast. So will a sophisticated forecast outperform a naive forecast? In a lot of cases, yes. It's all about how you go about it. But yes, I do think that is one area where we'll definitely see an improvement. It might not help all companies. There's plenty of companies that can get their effective lead times to be smaller than what's considered the customer tolerance time. So if the customer will wait a week for the product to be delivered, and you can get every step of the supply done individually within a week, then replacing an ADU with a probabilistic forecast is probably not going to make much difference to you. But the moment that you see that your tolerance time starts getting smaller, or in some case close to this effective lead time, you're going to start seeing an incremental benefit of having a better demand signal.
In that case, there's one more question that I have in mind, is that how do you manage this probability distribution error, and how is it so different from the statistical error like MEP or MSC?
So in terms of probability distributions, we like to speak of the uncertainty that it represents to distinguish it from error. The error basically says, I forecasted 100 and it ended up being 80, so I've got a 20% error. The uncertainty is not described in a single number, it's described as a distribution itself. So we do have an error on the probabilistic side, and that is how closely does that distribution fit the real distribution. There could be a difference between those two distributions. So it's a different view of what is really an error and what's uncertainty. So if you think about, if I can give another example, you're throwing a couple of dice, 2 dice. On average, you're going to throw a 7. That's a statistical forecast. And if you throw a dice 12 times, once every month, you're going to get 12. You're going to forecast 12 sevens, right? Because your expected number 7 is not going to change, so you're going to forecast a stationary series of 7s. And if you do that long enough, you're going to get an error, in the order of, I think it's something like 20%. But that's not really an error. It's just the natural variability, right? So that concept of error is bad. You're convoluting these two things, real error and natural variability. You need to separate those two out. And that's what the difference between the uncertainty, which is really the variability, but expressed as a probability distribution, and the error are really considered as two separate things. And you want to reduce the error in your forecasting process. The uncertainty generally cannot be reduced by the forecaster. It needs to be reduced by planning decisions, contract decisions. That, it can be reduced, but usually not by the same person that gets blamed when something goes wrong with the forecast.
Thank you, Stefan. What is your closing comment for demand planning people here, or supply chain people here, as far as demand under uncertainty is concerned?
I would say that in academics, there's an enormous amount of innovation going on, and it has been for decades. We're not seeing that yet in the industry, and we're not seeing it in a lot of the certification institutions. So I would say, don't go by what is recommended by big software vendors. Do your research first. Determine what's out there, what you need. And if you determine that, for example, if you're a spare parts supplier, that you've got enormous intermittency, you really don't have any other choice but a probabilistic forecast. If you've got a very high velocity product flow, you can probably find products out there that there's many of them and you have your pick. Most companies will find themselves somewhere in the middle. Do your homework, pick a tool that fits your needs, but do your research independently before you start asking for outside help. And especially if you do ask for outside help, whether that's consultants or analysts, don't let the same team help you select what it is you need and design what it is you need, as well as implement it, because you're going to end up with the old-fashioned but most expensive solution there is. So do your homework. I think that is that's the most important part. And I'm on LinkedIn, so I do like to respond to questions I get from people. So if anyone does have questions, if and when I can, I will respond and give answers if you have very specific questions.
We can take few questions, Stefan. We may take some questions.
Yep.
All right. Has anyone raised hands? You can make them ask questions also.
Okay. You're going to feed them to me, right?
Oh.
Stefan, there's a question for you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
There's a question from you. Don't you think the market demand of analytics of the finished goods, along with contractual business allocation commitments from customer, can play more vital role for manufacturers to go for statistical forecasts? Example, Walmart and Amazon business model must have to depend on such scenarios, from Gaurav Arora.
They must have two different scenarios. Sorry, I couldn't hear the last part. Walmart and Amazon?
Yeah, example, Walmart and Amazon business model must have to depend on such scenarios.
Yeah, so this is, I think, a very clear distinction between what do you plan and what do you forecast. And so a number of these things belong definitely in the tactical space. And most focus there is probably going to be on planning to try to get ready to influence the market. So something we didn't mention explicitly today, demand shaping. We're basically influencing the market. Amazon is doing that very hard, of course, not just their own market, but basically they're shaping the market for everyone else too, setting expectations that are really hard for other companies to meet. Walmart used to do a lot more shaping, and when they switched to everyday low prices, that became a little less promotion driven, more everyday pricing. Of course, these are strategic decisions that these companies made. They have tactical repercussions which demand real thorough planning, but ultimately, when you respond to it, that's when your forecasts just have to work around that which you know and that which you don't, whatever that market condition may be. If you want to influence that, you have to be ahead of the game. You got to do it sooner. If you're going to do that in the operational range, you're too late.
There's a question from Girikant Arduna from SAP. So when we use probabilistic forecasting for operational planning, we are still working with a single demand number for replenishment, but the variance is being used in safety stock determination. Is this understanding right?
I would say that's a good starting point. So if you imagine determining what inventory you should be targeting, what your safety stock or reorder level should be, having a better understanding of the uncertainty of demand will definitely give you better numbers than if you just assumed it was normal. But again, that's a starting point, right? It's I would almost say that's the lowest hanging fruit. If you think about a probabilistic forecast being expressed as a whole distribution, you can do the same thing with plans. Every number that's uncertain could be distributions. And so what you're basically doing is replacing all the math based on the average with math that is going to consider all options. And only at the very end, when you need to make a decision, you're going to say, hey, how can I condense that? What's my average and what are my worst and best cases? But under the hood, you could have a probabilistic calculation all the way through. But that is easier said than done. That's gonna take a lot of design and development over the years.
Thank you, Stefan. The next question is from Shanmukh Singh. Stefan rightly spoke about confidence in our forecasting model. Usually higher the significance of a forecast and model, the more accurately we are able to plan for the future. But models with low significance often perform poorly. What ways can we improve the significance to better use forecast in our planning function?
So confidence and significance is one way to look at that problem. I like to slice it slightly different and look at it in terms of accuracy versus precision. Where precision is how close are my numbers to each other. So if I were to take a shot at a target, how close are they to all the shots to each other? Where accuracy is how close are they to the target. And if you look at it from that perspective, accuracy is something that you cannot know ahead of time because the actuals are not known. But precision is something that you can know ahead of time completely. You know how close your numbers are to each other, or if you have a distribution, how narrow, how peaked the distribution is, or how wide the tails are. You know that ahead of time. So by changing the focus to minimizing your error, or in other words, maximizing your accuracy, you can now have a bigger portion, which is the precision that you know ahead of time exactly what it is, and that's what you can buffer for. Whereas when you've got some kind of blend of the two, and the significance, confidence is another, it's not as clear distinction along those lines. It makes it hard to know where your target is. And so you don't know if you're already doing really good and you need to spend your attention elsewhere, or if there's a lot of opportunity left to improve it. So that's the problem with almost any other perspective that I found in that regard. So change that perspective to accuracy, precision, and then focus on maximizing the accuracy.
There's one more question. In the Indian FMCG scenario, where there is a high level of promotion and SKU proliferation, new launches, highly dynamic market, what kind of forecasting strategy would you recommend? From Adil Ilevia from Kellogg's.
So my default answer, probabilistic forecasting, of course. And the reason I say that for this one is traditional forecasts like to operate at levels of aggregation and then split down, because patterns are smoother. Once you're at levels of aggregation, you're trying to fit a curve through it. But what we've in the past and prior companies I've worked for, we've done benchmarks of the accuracy of a high-level forecast versus the accuracy at a split forecast, and there's tremendous loss. Most forecast accuracy loss is actually in splitting down. So if you can go bottom up, and that's really the core of the answer, if you can go bottom up, you lose that error introduction from the splitting, because when you sum up, it's unique, right? There's no infinite number of ways to do that. There's one way. And so a probabilistic forecast loves intermittency. It loves detail. The more detail you can give it, the better forecast you can get. So you can still sum it up to a certain level of aggregation, interact with it there. But you're going to get the best low-level forecast. And that's going to be extremely important when you get proliferated, fragmented, dynamic data. If you imagine a high-level forecast at a monthly time granularity, most traditional, you're going to need many months worth of data to start seeing new patterns. If there's a spike, you have no idea if it's a pattern or a blip. If you're looking at, say, daily data, very detailed, you're going to start seeing within the month these patterns emerging much sooner. So that's the answer to the dynamic part. As you look in that detail, you can see if it's a trend, if it's an outlier, and you know how to respond to it much, much sooner.
Thank you, Stefan. The last question that we will have with you is, post-COVID, how can organization leverage demand planning considering segregation of products into essential and non-essential categories? There are a lot of category proliferation and changes that you have seen, the consumer behavior.
I don't know if COVID really helps determine which ones, but it will definitely help everyone align to the concept that maybe all our proliferation has made things very hard for us, and probably also long lead times for far away but cheap suppliers. Those are this kind of things that have been a pattern in the past that I don't think were always for the better of the company. What this crisis that we're in today has shown us, and more people, is that that might not be the right way. So now it allows you to look at your portfolio, look at your supply strategy, your network, and basically re-evaluate if it's up to snuff. And maybe it's a good reason to get rid of a lot of slow-moving items, or maybe a lot of items that are especially susceptible to disruption. But other than that, I think it's up to every business themselves to qualify what are their strategic items, whether they're commodity items. There's not. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer for that.
All right, thank you, Stefan. And I'll request Jaisal to come over and give the vote of thanks.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. And thank you, Stefan, for being there. It was indeed an insightful and wonderful session, and I think a good takeaway for all the attendees who were there today. Thank you once again. And I would also like to thank all my attendees, and a big shout to the entire ISCM team for making it happen. Thank you so much.